I'm grateful to be here today to deliver the final message in the series on the book of Daniel. As your pastors have already shared, there is much we can learn from Daniel about resilient faith. Late biblical scholar Joyce Baldwin wrote, "History is made in the tension between promise and fulfillment." We are certainly living in those days right now. In 2019, my family visited Kyiv, Ukraine, where my sister and her husband were living at the time. We learned a great deal about the country's history, particularly through the city's architecture. Ukraine has a long, storied past, and the Ukrainian people have a long memory. Walking around Kyiv, one cannot go more than a few blocks downtown without seeing a monument to someone here or there. Some of the most prominent ones that I saw were in memory of those who lost their lives in 2014's revolution. This week, the people of Ukraine find themselves, again, in circumstances not of their own choosing, engaged in a conflict that has many fleeing their homes, while men between the ages of 18 and 60 are being required to stay in the country to take up arms to fight the invaders. Many women are choosing to stay and do the same. US President Biden is among the many world leaders scrambling right now to sanction Russia for this bold advance, even offering to evacuate Ukrainian President Zelensky. But yesterday, President Zelensky replied, "Sir, the fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." You could hear the pain in his voice. I also watched a clip yesterday of Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations Security Council address the Security Council just after Russia had vetoed a resolution condemning their invasion. Ukraine's ambassador, Serhiy Kislitsia, seated across from the Russian delegation, asked the council for a moment of prayer. He said, "Pray for peace. Pray for the souls of those who have already been killed. Pray for the souls of those who are yet to lose their lives." And to the Russian ambassador, he looked in the eye and said, "Pray for your salvation." Watching the video, you could see the pain of an entire country, their frustration, how utterly alone they feel, how overpowered, and how frightened. A couple of weeks ago, your pastor, Karen Campbell, pointed out that Daniel was also living in a place not of his own choosing. In his years in captivity and exile, Daniel knew the pain of loneliness. He knew what it felt like to be overpowered. He knew fear. And in verse 8 this morning, we heard Daniel ask the question that the people of Ukraine are asking right now. How long? How long will this trouble last? When will it be over? Will anyone help us? When will God deliver us? Now, that does not mean that Daniel did not trust in God's promises. Daniel was counted among the wise who turned to God for deliverance. But that did not mean that the path forward was always clear for Daniel, or that God's deliverance felt near in every moment, especially in the darkest moments of his life. In his lifetime, Daniel experienced God delivering him from trouble when God gave him a vision for the king Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel experienced God delivering him through the trouble of a den of lions when he refused to pray to King Darius. And at this point in his story, Daniel is awaiting God's final deliverance by death. As Pastor Mead pointed out in his last message, Daniel was in his 80s at the time of this story, at the end of his book. And when Daniel asks, how long will it be until God's promises are fulfilled, we hear numbers that some have tried to interpret literally, but as we are in a Western context, we need to shift to the Eastern way of thinking, which is symbolic. The meaning in those numbers is a powerful one, but it is not in the literal numbers. It is in the symbols that God is communicating through those numbers. And those numbers communicate, in this text, a call to persevere. To persevere until the power of the one who shatters God's holy people has been exhausted. God is asking Daniel to wait. We heard that there will be those who choose wickedness, those who choose to deny God and serve themselves alone, and the consequences of their wickedness await them. But there will also be those who are wise, like Daniel, those who are uncompromising in their love of God and their love for God's image bearers, and they will receive God's promised rest. Scholar Wendy Witter points out that Daniel shows us what it means to trust that God is going to right all the wrongs in the world. Daniel shows us what faithfulness looks like. And it is not, friends, when everything is going well in our lives. Daniel shows us that faithfulness is illustrated most clearly when our dreams are dying. Faithfulness is about us demonstrating our trust, showing our wisdom through our faith. Wisdom is to keep going until the end without giving up or giving in. Wisdom is persevering because you trust that deliverance is at hand. In the first verse, we heard that Michael, the one who fights for us, will be there with us, even as we suffer. Now, in the original Hebrew, Michael is described literally as the one who watches over your children, the most vulnerable among you. They are being watched over by God. In the same way, we read that God consistently resides with the vulnerable in the scriptures. Some have even suggested it is when we are most vulnerable, when we are in our deepest state of suffering, that we are actually most prepared to enter the presence of God. Because sometimes it is only in that state that we are keenly aware of just how much we need God. God tells Daniel that there will be those who choose to spend their time mastering the text in order to predict the end, to predict the outcome of God's story. Perhaps this is why God asks that the words about the end days be sealed, not to hide them, but to protect them and to protect us. Because along with Daniel, we won't understand until that day comes. Along with Daniel, we are not being asked to understand everything. Sometimes we are being asked to wait. To resist the pull of this world, to invest our time and our resources in pursuits that only give us a false sense of control or a mastery of knowledge. God is calling us instead to the kind of risky righteousness described in Malachi 3:18. Resisting the temptation to numb our pain, rejecting complacency about injustice, refusing to remain at a distance from the suffering of others. Because that is where God is. Because it is when we enter into dark spaces where other people feel lonely and overpowered and afraid, that is where the light of God's love shines the brightest. Friends, Jesus chose to live in exile from heaven. Jesus chose to live in captivity to the time and space of this world in order to see that all of us who will one day sleep in death, those who have been delivered from our pain, will rise. The promised resurrection of the body is introduced here in Daniel 12 for the first time and made visible in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We will experience death, but death does not have the final word. And at the resurrection, this passage states, we will all face judgment. And judgment, friends, is not something to fear, something rather that we should welcome. Because it is at Judgment Day that the world's injustices will be reckoned with. And when our hearts are aligned with the heart of God, when we are with those at the margins, when we sit with those who mourn and comfort those who are suffering, God's judgment is received as a welcome gift, not as something to fear. Like Daniel, we didn't choose captivity or exile, but that is often where we find ourselves, especially when we follow Jesus closely. Like Daniel, we live with much uncertainty. And when we feel out of control, what sets us apart as people who follow God is our commitment to loving God and loving our neighbors as ourselves. Our righteousness is demonstrated in how we treat those who are vulnerable, the poor, the lonely, the suffering. Because as we heard in Matthew 25, it is in welcoming them that we welcome the presence of God into our lives. Though one day we will sleep in dust, another day we will rise and stand with God, and then we will find final rest with Him. We rise through our acts of mercy for others. We rise through our risky righteousness and through our faithfulness to a God who is consistently faithful to us, even when we can't feel it, even when we don't understand it. I don't know about you, but I cling pretty tightly these days to the promise of spring. With the woodpecker and the wren in my backyard, I wait, although perhaps not as patiently as they do. I have a neighbor, Jessica, who is an avid gardener. Her passion for growing things is infectious, so much so that I made some meager attempts last fall in my garden. I moved a couple of peonies that my rhododendron was overpowering. I cleared out an invasive vine that was taking over my orchids. But my biggest project was joining Jessica in planting tulip bulbs. A few years ago, Jessica planted a long few rows on her curb lawn, bringing a little piece of tulip time to our neighborhood in the spring. When I told her how much I admired her tulips, she said she was hoping to plant more and offered to order me some bulbs. I said, "Great, that sounds awesome," not quite knowing what I was getting myself into. When the bulbs arrived earlier than Jessica would have liked in the fall, she stored them in the cool darkness of her basement, telling me we have to wait until just the right time to plant them. When it was time, she showed me how to dig trenches along our curb lawn. And then she brought out her ruler and measured along the trenches to ensure we had just the right depth and that the depth was even. And if it wasn't even, she came over with a little bit of dirt and filled it in so that it would be straight. Our 4-year-old neighbor, Everett, was very curious about what we were doing. So he came, and when it was time to plant the bulbs, he helped me put the bulbs in the ground. Jessica instructed us the way to position them carefully, the ideal distance between them. We mixed 2 varieties of bulbs, spreading them evenly. We sprinkled some dirt, and then fertilizer, and then more dirt before watering them. And we covered the trench with chicken wire so that the neighborhood squirrels would not undo everything that we had done. Finally, we laid down wood chips. I was out there for about 6 hours from start to end. Everett and I planted 200 bulbs. Yeah, Jessica doesn't mess around with her tulips. I went into my house that evening exhausted. And when I got up and passed by a window later that night, I saw Jessica still outside, in the dark, meticulously checking our work, carefully fixing things, watching over those vulnerable tulip bulbs, not unlike the way God watches over vulnerable us. Planting those tulips with Jessica was an act of hope for me. When I planted them, I didn't know if I would still be living in my house in the spring. I had lost my job last fall, and I didn't know what was next and where God would call me. And almost 6 months later, I still don't know where I will end up. Like Daniel, I continue to ask God, how long? And God continues to answer me, it's not for you to know right now, but just know that I've got this. Persevere. Wait with expectation. And I have experienced the mercies and God's good grace during that time at my new church home in Vivo. It's a small community of people, many of whom have been told they don't belong in the church because of their sexual identity. And they made a small church home where my husband and I and our teenager have found incredible welcome. With them, we wait with expectation. With them, we persevere. With them, we seek to live the risky righteousness that God calls us to live as God's children. As you enter this season of Lent here as a community of the people of God at Church of the Servant, seeking to grow as disciples in your study of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Life Together, I pray that you will experience what it means to wait with expectation, looking forward with hope to rising and resting with God, and that you will be able to discern together how God is calling you as a community to live the risky righteousness through prayer and advocacy for the people of Ukraine and for all those people living in captivity and exile today. Amen.